August 21, 1942. Guadalcanal. The jungle is still dark when the first faint glow rises behind the ridgeline, spreading a pale silver across the canopy. The air hangs heavy with moisture, thick enough to taste, carrying the scent of mud, oil, and distant seawater drifting in from the slot. For a moment, the island seems asleep, but nothing on Guadalcanal truly rests. Along the edge of Henderson Field, U.S. Marines stand in silence, silhouettes against the dim light of early dawn. Their uniforms are soaked, their bodies worn thin from weeks of constant alert, but their eyes remain fixed on the open strip of land carved out of the jungle. Above them, barely audible at first, comes the low, steady drone of an aircraft engine warming on the runway. It is a sound that has become the island's heartbeat, American power expressed not through words, but through machinery and endurance. That engine's rising hum carries across the island, echoing through the banyan trees and over the empty paths where Japanese reconnaissance teams once moved unseen. To the Marines, it is reassurance. To the Japanese watching from the darkness beyond the perimeter, it is a warning. And it is within this sound that the story of Henderson Field and everything it would come to represent begins to unfold, leading into the greater struggle taking shape across the Pacific. When the United States landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, it marked the first major American offensive of the Second World War. Until this moment, the Japanese Empire had expanded across the Pacific with astonishing speed, seizing territories from the Philippines to New Guinea. Tokyo believed it held the initiative, and many of its commanders viewed the Solomons as a secure perimeter. Guadalcanal, with its unfinished Japanese airstrip, was supposed to remain far from American reach. Yet the strategic picture was shifting. The U.S. Navy, recovering from Pearl Harbor, recognized that the Japanese airfield, later renamed Henderson Field, could threaten vital supply routes to Australia. Capturing it was not merely tactical, it was a message that the United States would not remain on the defensive. The Marines who landed on the island were aware of this significance, even if the full weight of it had not yet settled on their exhausted shoulders. The Japanese reacted with disbelief. They expected the Americans to avoid major operations for many months, perhaps even until 1943. Their first counterattacks were hasty, underestimating American resolve and the growing presence of U.S. aircraft. Japanese planners assumed the Marines were isolated, undersupplied, and vulnerable to the jungle's harsh grip. In many ways, they were. The heat was suffocating, rations ran short, and the thick vegetation created a claustrophobic world where every sound hinted at danger. But Henderson Field changed everything. The airstrip became the axis on which the entire campaign turned. Each morning, the sound of American engines rose from the runway, turning the skies into a battleground where the Japanese no longer held assured dominance. And each evening, as darkness fell and Japanese troops prepared for night operations, they carried a growing realization: the Americans were not breaking. Instead, they were entrenching themselves around a foothold that threatened Japan's strategic calculus. It was here, amid this uneasy balance of hardship and determination, that the deeper forces shaping the battle began to emerge. While the Marines tightened their perimeter around Henderson Field, far to the northwest in Rabaul, Japanese commanders debated how to respond. The sudden American occupation of Guadalcanal disrupted months of planning. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, often divided by rivalry, struggled to coordinate a unified counteroffensive. Intelligence officers insisted that the American presence was temporary, that the Marines lacked the strength to hold the airfield for long. Yet reconnaissance flights began reporting an unsettling pattern. The number of American aircraft on the ground kept increasing. The U.S. quickly transformed the crude airstrip into a functional base. Fighters and dive bombers, Grumman Wildcats, Douglas Dauntless, and later long-range B-17s scheduled for temporary deployment, began to arrive whenever weather and sea conditions allowed. These aircraft would soon form what became known as the Cactus Air Force, a patchwork assembly of pilots, mechanics, and ground crews from the Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Forces. Their presence was modest in number, but immense in effect. Japanese planners expected American aircraft to be worn down by bombardment and attrition, but they underestimated the speed and determination with which U.S. mechanics repaired damaged planes. Throughout August and September, wrecks that should have been scrapped were coaxed back into service, engines rebuilt under open skies, wings patched with improvised materials. Each afternoon, Japanese pilots who expected crippled opposition instead met the same fighters they believed they had destroyed the day before. Reports filtering back to Rabaul reflected growing frustration. Commanders noted that every daylight movement, troop landings, barge convoys, or artillery shifts was punished from above. The Japanese army, accustomed to maneuvering freely during Pacific operations, now faced a battlefield where the skies no longer belonged to them. Every sunrise brought the same mechanical symbol of American resilience, the familiar, unyielding drone of aircraft lifting from Henderson Field. It was this shifting balance, slow at first, then undeniable, that set the stage for the deeper human, tactical, and psychological struggles about to unfold. Human angle, the endurance of the Marines. The Marines who held Henderson Field were not elite shock troops or fresh reinforcements brought into battle with overwhelming superiority. Many were young men who never imagined fighting for their lives on a remote island half the world away. Their living conditions were harsh beyond expectation. Tropical rain turned foxholes into pools of stagnant water. Malaria swept through the ranks with the persistence of an unseen enemy. Rations grew so thin that men counted calories more than hours. Yet even in these conditions, a quiet resilience took hold. What the Japanese expected was a force collapsing under hunger, exhaustion, and isolation. But what they encountered instead was a uniquely American adaptation. Men who improvised, endured, and fought with a sense of duty that grew stronger each day the airfield remained in their hands. They built shelters from scrap metal, shared water, and rotated watch shifts with silent cooperation. The constant drone of American engines overhead, sometimes strong, sometimes faint, served as a reminder that they were not forgotten, not abandoned, and not fighting alone. The human cost was heavy, but each Marine knew the significance of the ground they defended. Henderson Field was more than a strategic asset. It was a symbol of American determination to push back against an empire that believed itself unstoppable. And this human resilience formed the bedrock on which every other advantage would stand. Tactical angle, the perimeter that refused to break. From the earliest days of the campaign, U.S. commanders understood that survival depended on shaping the terrain around Henderson Field into a defensive stronghold. The Marines constructed a wide perimeter that fused natural obstacles with deliberate lines of fire. They positioned machine gun nests along ridges, cleared fields of vision near the airstrip, and learned to anticipate Japanese night infiltration tactics. Though they lacked manpower, they used meticulous placement and overlapping fire to compensate for undermanning. Japanese forces assumed their favored tactic. Night assaults delivered with sudden violence would splinter the American lines as it had in earlier campaigns across Asia. But Guadalcanal proved different. the Marines adapted with remarkable speed. Units rehearsed silent communication, coordinated flares, and timed counterfire to break the momentum of massed Japanese charges. American artillery crews, despite shortages of shells, learned to fire with precision during the darkest hours, illuminating the jungle with sudden arcs of light. Every position was anchored with purpose: the western ridge protecting the airstrip, the southern approach guarding the supply lines, the eastern jungle preventing encirclement. While Japanese commanders believed they were attacking a fixed target, the Marines understood they were defending the beating heart of the island. They fought not only to repel the enemy, but to ensure that Henderson Field's runway would remain clear for aircraft at dawn. Tactical discipline fused with necessity, shaping a perimeter that simply... By mid-October 1942, the tension around Guadalcanal reached its breaking point. Japanese high command concluded that unless Henderson Field was obliterated, the campaign would slip beyond recovery. Their solution was decisive and unprecedented: a night bombardment by two Congo-class battleships, Congo and Haruna, escorted by destroyers moving swiftly down the slot. On the evening of October 13th, as darkness settled over the island, the Marines sensed a weight in the air, a silence thick enough to press against the skin. It broke moments later in a shattering roar. For over an hour, the battleships hurled high-caliber shells across the airfield with methodical precision. Explosions tore apart revetments, ignited fuel stores, and shattered aircraft frames. The ground shook as if the earth itself were convulsing under the barrage. Flames rose high above the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the shattered runway. The Cactus Air Force, already battered, seemed on the verge of extinction. Marines clung to the earth, each detonation a reminder that the Japanese believed this night would decide the fate of Guadalcanal. By dawn, Henderson Field lay scarred, cratered, and strewn with debris. Wreckage smoldered where aircraft once stood ready. Japanese observers believed the mission had succeeded, that without air power, the Marines were trapped. But then, through smoke still drifting over the runway, came a familiar sound. A single aircraft engine coughed, sputtered, then steadied into a low, determined drone. Ground crews, working through the night, had salvaged what little remained. The airfield was battered, but it was not dead. And what happened next would show the Japanese that destruction alone could not break American resolve. The bombardment had been intended to pave the way for the final Japanese ground assault, and on October 24 to 25, 1942, that assault came with full force. Under the command of Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayutake, Japanese divisions moved silently through the dense jungle south of the airfield, converging on the ridges and riverbanks that guarded the Marines' lines. Their objective was simple and absolute: break through, seize Henderson Field, and erase the American presence before the battered airstrip could recover. But the Marines were ready. Along the southern sector, Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller's men braced for impact. They fought through darkness, lit only by muzzle flashes and the brief flare of exploding shells. Waves of Japanese infantry pressed forward with fierce determination, slipping through ravines and across open patches of ground in coordinated attacks. Yet each advance met a mixture of rifle fire, machine guns, and precise artillery that shattered momentum at critical moments. The Japanese expected panic. Instead, they found discipline carved by weeks of hardship. And then came daylight. Despite the devastation from the battleship bombardment, the Cactus Air Force had clawed itself back into the sky. Repaired fighters and dive bombers, patched together through exhaustion and ingenuity, rose from the airstrip one by one. They swept over the battlefield, targeting Japanese units exposed by the night's fighting. The effect was immediate and devastating. Positions that had nearly broken the Marine line dissolved under the weight of aerial assault. By the afternoon of October 25th, the Japanese offensive faltered. Momentum shifted. Henderson Field, shattered but alive, had once again asserted its power. And from this turning point, the consequences of the failed assault began to unfold. When the final Japanese attacks dissolved on October 25, the jungle fell into an uneasy stillness. Smoke drifted over the southern ridges, and the ground bore the imprint of a battle that had pushed both sides to their limits. But the outcome was unmistakable. Henderson Field remained in American hands. For the Japanese command, the failure carried a weight far heavier than the tactical losses themselves. Reports reaching Rabaul described units shattered by exhaustion, artillery stripped away by precise American fire, and entire battalions reduced to fractions of their original strength. Most alarming were the accounts of airpower. Officers detailed how aircraft, assumed destroyed by the battleship bombardment, reappeared in the sky within hours. They reported pilots who believed they had eliminated the last American fighter over the field, only to encounter the same aircraft returning the next day. Ground units described the psychological toll of fighting under a sky where enemy aircraft could appear at any moment, forcing every advance to become a calculation of risk. The Japanese army, accustomed to dictating the pace of combat, now moved only in the narrow windows when the airfield's engines fell silent. American observers documented the cost with equal clarity. The Marines had suffered heavy casualties, and the airfield remained cratered and fragile. Yet morale rose sharply in the days that followed. Henderson Field had survived what was intended to destroy it. The battered aircraft that still rose from its runway symbolized more than survival. They demonstrated that American strength rested not only in weaponry, but in the endurance and ingenuity behind it. And as Japanese commanders absorbed the failure of their most concentrated effort, a deeper realization began to settle over their planning rooms. The campaign was shifting beyond their control. The battle fell silent, but the silence was nothing like peace. It was the heavy, breath-stealing quiet that follows chaos, a quiet shaped by smoke drifting in the air and the echo of decisions that could never be undone. As the dust settled, ruined armor lay scattered across the torn landscape, each twisted plate of metal telling its own story of impact, survival, or sudden defeat. And in the center of it all stood the soldiers who had lived through the storm, trying to make sense of what remained. Some stared at the wreckage with disbelief, replaying moments that had unfolded too fast to fully grasp. Others moved with mechanical focus, checking weapons, counting surviving crew members, trying to steady their hands. Victory had been claimed, yes, but at a cost everyone could feel. No one celebrated, no one cheered. They simply breathed, almost in gratitude, because breathing meant they were still here. Commanders walked the lines, taking silent note of who was missing. The names would be written down later, but in that moment, the loss was already carved into the expressions of the men. Radios buzzed with fractured reports, mentioning reinforcement routes, fuel shortages, and damaged engines. Yet beneath all the practical details lingered the question no one dared to speak. Would they be ready when the next wave came? Because the aftermath was not an ending. It was only the thin pause between battles, a moment to gather strength before history demanded more from them, and they all knew it. When the battle finally faded into memory, what remained was not the roar of engines or the crack of cannon fire. It was the questions that rose quietly in the minds of those who survived. Reflection came slowly, like a shadow stretching across the ground at dusk. For many, it was the first moment they had to truly think, to confront the reality hidden beneath the adrenaline of combat. Some wondered how fate had chosen who lived and who didn't. They replayed the smallest decisions, when to advance, when to take cover, when to fire, and realized how thin the line had been between survival and oblivion. Others tried to understand what the victory meant. Was it courage that brought them through, or simply circumstance? The answers were different for each man, and some preferred not to search for them at all. What struck them most was how the battlefield changed them. Confidence was tempered with humility, fear transformed into caution, and the idea of heroism became something quieter, less about glory, more about endurance. They realized that true strength wasn't in the metal of the machines they operated, but in the resolve to rise again after chaos tried to break them. As they cleaned their weapons, repaired their vehicles, and prepared for whatever lay ahead, the reflection lingered. It didn't weaken them. If anything, it sharpened their focus, because understanding the weight of the past gave them a clearer sense of the road forward. And though none said it out loud, they all carried the same truth. The battle had ended, but its imprint would stay with them forever.